Alexandria Serra, and this is Lawyer Talk Thursday. Today we're talking about the hot topic of defunding the police. My goal here today is to educate what it means, what the arguments are on each side, and to get rid of that bad information that's out there. Listen, if you're going to have your voice heard one way or another, you need to know what you're fighting for. But first, a quick government lesson. So a lot of you got this wrong on my quiz. Police are actually part of the executive branch, not the judicial branch. If you think that the executive branch, you think enforcers of the law. The judicial branch interprets the law and the legislative makes the law, so they can check each other. So judges here in El Paso County should actually be checking police conduct. Police officers are trained to enforce the law, and they're not adequately trained or can't fix many of the social issues that they're forced to deal with, like homelessness, poverty, mental health care issues, and rampant systemic racism that happens absolutely everywhere. I don't care what you say. So that's where this idea of defunding the police comes from, that the police aren't adequately trained to deal with these type of social problems. So the concept is take some of the funding and duties from the police and reallocate it or give it away to more social programs. Defunding the police doesn't mean getting rid of the police. The phrase defunding the police gives us a lot of different emotions because it sounds like we're getting rid of the police force in general. But there's many examples across the United States of cities defunding or limiting funding for the police. An example would be Durham, North Carolina. They had a little bit of excess city budget, and instead of increasing the police force, they chose to increase part-time city employee salaries. You may not know this, but police are asked to do so many things. They respond to domestic disturbance calls where a crime hasn't even been committed. They respond to mental health care calls. They transport people who are having a mental breakdown or psychological issues under emergency detention orders to EHN or another psychiatric facility. So they're asked to do so many things while they're on patrol. And it just takes a little bit of change. So let's say we allocate a portion of police budget to 911 dispatchers or creating a crisis intervention team. Austin did this last September, where they created a program, a crisis intervention team that includes an EMT or nurse, right, a medical professional, and a crisis professional. So someone trained in mental health or crisis intervention that work together and respond to these type of calls. So when a 911 call comes in Austin, the operators are trained whether to ask if it's police, fire, or a mental health care emergency. So if it's a mental health care emergency, they dispatch this crisis outreach team who are highly trained in that area to respond. And it keeps their police officers patrolling the streets where they belong. So that addresses some examples of response, but defunding the police also includes prevention. So creating more public housing, pouring more money into community rec centers and things for underprivileged youth in poor communities, creating more awareness on mental health issues, racism, poverty, all of these things. So those kind of nonprofit organizations, NGOs, anything of that nature is also part of the argument for defunding a portion of police money. Another alternative that's been discussed is the concept of community policing. And community policing isn't people of the community policing themselves. It's having designated officers in communities that are focused on getting to know the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, getting to know the dynamic, whether that's the demographic, how things work in the neighborhood, what are the issues there, so that they better know how to deal with that particular community. Because we know one size doesn't fit all, and sometimes that leads to the increased violence, harassment, and other things by police officers that some people face. Again, guys, we're just here to educate today. Whatever side that you fall on, that's great. But you need to be informed of what all of these phrases and definitions mean so you can adequately argue your position. Now let's talk about some of the more radical arguments, like dismantling the police force like they did in Camden, New Jersey, or abolishing the police force for privatized police. I encourage you to do your research on private prisons. They're terrible. So privatizing a police force is a bad idea. But the good thing about El Paso PD is the police department and city officials are willing to work together to solve some of these problems. And defunding, reallocating, reforming can be an option. So we as a community can work together to solve these problems. One of the responses by the federal government is to introduce the Justice and Policing Act into the legislature. And that act bans, of course, racial profiling, things like that, inclusive of chokeholds, no-knock warrants for drug cases, mandates certain types of training for police officers, makes it easier to prosecute police officers that use deadly force, and also creates a system where local governments, municipalities have to send their data on use of force to the feds, and then the feds can investigate those situations. The point is that the steps we've taken aren't adequate. The crisis intervention team that we have to address mental health care calls is not big enough and not adequately funded for our community. So we've taken steps. Let's take some more. Listen, all of us should want accountability. From those people who have been harassed and abused by police officers, which happens in this county, to those who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes. We all want accountability, so let's make that happen. And one way we're going to talk about accountability is next week on Lawyer Talk Thursday. I have both candidates for district attorney here to talk about their plans for a conviction integrity unit, how to deal with police officer issues, use of deadly force, and all your other questions. So tune in next week.